On a warm, golden afternoon, James, despite being a billionaire, chose to live one of his favorite truths: music belongs to everyone. With a simple guitar and a heartfelt voice, he sang on a busy street corner, drawing strangers into a quiet spell of admiration. People stopped, smiled, filmed, and whispered about the raw talent they had stumbled upon. But not Clara. Hearing the applause, she pushed her way forward, lifted her chin, and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "My ears deserve better than this atrocity." The crowd froze, stunned by her cruelty. James said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze, letting the moment wash over him. The very next day, fate tightened the strings between them. Clara, excited about meeting the new billionaire who had moved into the mansion next door, strutted across the lawn only to freeze in absolute horror when James opened the door. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down, acting even more arrogant than before. What she didn't know was that life had already started rearranging its pieces, giving James unexpected power, opportunities, and twists that would turn her arrogance into her downfall. Something tells you that the story is just getting started. What humiliations will Clara face? How far will James go without ever raising his voice? And how does a simple song end up changing two lives forever? But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's uncover how this story truly began. James Sterling had spent the entire morning locked in back-to-back negotiations, the kind that slowly ate at a man's spirit, even when he was winning. His board expected perfection, the market demanded brilliance, and the world saw him as nothing but the powerful, polished CEO who always kept his tie straight and his tone controlled. But the single thing that brought him back to himself, the one ritual that reminded him he was more than numbers and mergers, was his vintage guitar. That afternoon, after dismissing his driver and walking alone through the park, he sat on a weathered wooden bench under a wide oak tree. He unlatched the guitar case gently, almost reverently. The case remained closed for money. He never played for tips. He played because music was the one companion that didn't expect anything from him, the one voice that didn't demand answers. His fingers slid into place before he even thought about the first chord. The moment he strummed, the harsh rhythm of corporate life fell away. Each note softened the tightness in his chest, letting him breathe again. People began to gather, mothers pushing strollers, retired couples taking slow walks, college students with earbuds hanging around their necks. They stopped not because the man looked remarkable in his simple linen shirt and jeans. He looked intentionally ordinary, but because the music tugged at something gentle inside them. A few people whispered, "Who is he? He's incredible." No one recognized him, and that anonymity felt like oxygen. But then the crowd shifted, subtly at first, then sharply. A woman in white heels and a fitted designer dress pushed through, annoyed that anyone would stand in her path. Clara Davenport, the kind of woman who treated her name like a crown and her wealth like a weapon, looked down at James with the disdain of someone inspecting dirt on marble. Her gaze skimmed over the dark skin, the simple clothes, and jumped to the guitar at his knee. Assumptions hardened instantly. "Oh, wonderful!" she announced loudly, her voice slicing through the quiet park. Another street performer thinking he can turn this place into a donation corner. James kept playing, letting the notes answer her rather than his words. For a brief moment, he hoped she would simply walk away. But prejudice rarely walked. It marched. Clara kicked the closed guitar case with the sharp toe of her heel. The music stopped. Gasps rippled through the small audience. James lifted his gaze slowly. His eyes weren't angry. Not yet, but they carried a depth, a quiet intelligence that made her falter for a single second. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, hands planted on her hips. "We don't want people like you turning this area into a ghetto. Go beg somewhere else." The words stung the air, not because they surprised him, He had heard every shade of ignorance throughout his life, but because in that moment, he'd simply been a man playing music for peace, not a CEO, not a symbol, not a threat. James stood. He was tall, taller than she expected, with a presence that didn't need insults or volume. He dusted off his hands, not because of dirt, but because it gave him a second to contain the part of him that wanted to shout. "I don't need your money, ma'am," he said softly. "But you clearly need some grace." Her cheeks flushed with outrage. No one talked back to Clara Davenport, especially not someone she had already decided was beneath her. "I'll call security," she snapped. "I can have you removed from this park. Don't test me." James didn't respond. He knelt, placed the guitar back into its case with a care that contrasted sharply with her violence, and lifted it onto his shoulder. The crowd parted for him with quiet respect. He walked away not with anger, but with dignity, and that, more than anything, infuriated Clara. She turned to the remaining onlookers, attempting to reclaim control. "Some people have no shame," she muttered, loud enough for them to hear. But no one nodded. A few even exchanged uncomfortable glances. Clara felt the attention slipping away from her, and she clenched her fists. The next morning, the sound of a moving truck rumbling down the wealthy cul-de-sac pulled her out of bed. She hurried to her window with excitement tightening her chest. Finally, someone new, someone appropriate, someone she could proudly introduce to the neighborhood. Workers unloaded furniture wrapped in pristine protective film, boxes stamped with high-end branding, sculptures, a grand piano, expensive art crates. Clara smiled, already imagining dinner parties and social leverage. She slipped into a crisp white dress, grabbed a bottle of champagne worth more than most car payments, and hurried outside, but her smile froze mid-step. There, in the driveway of the mega mansion next door, was the man from the park. James stood calmly with his hands in his pockets, surveying the landscaping as though deciding which hedges needed trimming. Clara's mind scrambled for an explanation. He must be staff, a worker, a gardener, anyone except the truth she refused to consider. She snapped her fingers sharply. "Hey you! Tell the owner I'm here, and don't stand in the front driveway. Service staff belongs in the back." James turned slowly. There was a faint smile on his lips, not mocking, just tired, patient, knowing. "There's no one else here, Clara, just me." Her breath caught. "Stop lying," she stuttered. "I'll report you for trespassing." Just then, a sleek black limousine glided up the driveway. The driver stepped out, opened the door with a respectful nod, and said clearly, "Mr. Sterling, the board is waiting for the merger meeting." Clara froze. James paused before entering the limousine, met her stunned eyes, and said, "It's Mr. Sterling to you, and get off my property." Her world tilted. His had only just begun to settle. Clara had spent far too long preparing for this moment. She stood before her mirror, adjusting the crisp white dress she had chosen with deliberate precision. The fabric was expensive, structured, and designed to send a message: elegance, superiority, control. She dabbed perfume onto her wrists, practiced a smile that hovered somewhere between gracious and condescending, and grabbed the chilled bottle of champagne she had placed in a silver carrying pouch. This would be her introduction, an opportunity to assert her presence, to be seen as the social standard of the cul-de-sac, to make sure the new neighbor understood exactly who influenced the neighborhood. As she stepped out into the bright Georgia morning, the sunlight hit her dress with a soft glow, making her feel like she was stepping into a spotlight. Her heels clicked against the smooth stone walkway in a confident rhythm that reassured her she was in command of every detail. But that confidence wavered the moment she saw him. James stood in the wide driveway of the mega mansion next door, hands loosely in his pockets, head tilted slightly as he surveyed the landscaping, the hedges, the symmetry of the flower beds, the shape of the driveway curve. His posture was relaxed, thoughtful. He looked like someone considering what changes might make the home feel more like his. But Clara didn't see thoughtfulness. She saw what she had decided she would see. A worker. A gardener, someone hired, not someone owning. Her assumptions clicked into place with chilling ease. Clara lifted her chin and walked faster, the champagne bottle swaying lightly at her side. She didn't bother masking the impatience in her voice. "Hey, you!" she snapped. James turned, slowly, almost gently, as if giving her the grace to reconsider her tone before he faced her. But she didn't. She snapped her fingers at him, 3 sharp, humiliating clicks of entitlement that broke the quiet morning air. "Tell the owner I'm here," she demanded. "And don't stand in the front driveway. Service staff belongs in the back." There was a moment, quiet, delicate, strange, where time seemed to stretch between them. A bird chirped somewhere behind them. The breeze brushed across James's shirt. And Clara, for a flicker of a heartbeat, realized she didn't actually know who she was talking to. James's expression barely shifted, but something in his eyes did. Amusement, irony, maybe even sadness. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "There's no one else here, Clara," he said softly. "Just me." Her entire world stuttered. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then her breath hitched in a small, strangled gasp that she attempted to disguise as a laugh. It came out dry, nervous, brittle. She pressed her free hand to her necklace as if the diamonds there could anchor her back into the reality she preferred. "Stop lying," she said, but her voice was thinner now, stretched tight like a wire. "I'll report you for trespassing." James didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't explain himself or try to soften the truth. He just watched her, not with anger, but with a kind of weary, knowing patience that made her feel exposed. Clara felt heat bloom under her skin. Her pulse sped up. Something under her ribs began to tremble. Indignation, disbelief, fear that she had misjudged the situation in a catastrophic way. Then the sleek black limousine turned into the driveway. Its polished surface reflected the sunlight with a blinding sheen. The engine hummed like a quiet declaration of power. Clara instinctively stepped back, her breath catching in her throat as the vehicle rolled to a stop just a few feet away. The driver stepped out, wearing a tailored black suit and the posture of someone trained to show respect only to those who commanded it. He opened the back door of the limousine with practiced grace. "Mr. Sterling?" the driver said clearly. "The board is waiting for the merger meeting." Clara's world cracked. The champagne bottle in her hand suddenly felt ridiculous, a symbol of an introduction she would never make, an offering to a social superior she had just treated like a servant. Her fingers tightened around the glass neck until her knuckles blanched. Her throat dried so quickly she could barely swallow. James took a step toward the open door, but he paused, deliberately, pointedly, and turned to her. For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, charged with an understanding too sharp to ignore. "It's Mr. Sterling to you," he said, his voice low, steady, indifferent in a way that cut deeper than anger. She felt the words like a slap, "and get off my property." He didn't wait for her reaction. He entered the limousine with quiet dignity, the door closing behind him with a soft, decisive click, the sound of a boundary sealed. A chapter ending, a reckoning beginning. The limousine pulled away, leaving Clara standing alone in a driveway that no longer felt like neutral ground, no longer felt safe, no longer felt like hers to dominate. She clutched the champagne bottle harder, realizing, too late, that her world had shifted, and she had been the one to push it out of place. Clara had never felt humiliation like the blow dealt to her in that driveway. It lingered on her skin like a stain she could not wash off. Every time she replayed James stepping into that limousine, every time she heard the driver's voice calling him Mr. Sterling, something inside her twisted into a knot of shame, disbelief, and a cold, growing resentment that took root deeper than she cared to admit. She felt small, unbearably small, and she didn't know how to live with that feeling. So she did what she always did when confronted with vulnerability. She buried it, masked it, weaponized it. Within days, her anger simmered into action. She marched into the homeowners association office with the same air of superiority she wore like a crown. Her smile was tight, brittle at the edges, but convincing enough to those who had always taken her word as gospel. She spoke in tones dripping with concern, as if she were sacrificing her own comfort for the good of the community. "He's disruptive," she told them, disturbing the peace, bringing in crowds, playing ethnic music at all hours. The lies flowed easily. She framed each complaint like she was protecting the neighborhood, when in truth, she was protecting her bruised pride. She filed reports one after another, claiming loud gatherings, suspicious visitors, non-compliance with noise ordinances. She produced photos taken at sharp angles, zoomed in too far, misrepresented. She didn't care that the dinner James hosted had been a quiet business meeting with 3 executives. She didn't care that she had never actually heard any music or laughter coming from his home. What she cared about was control, and she was losing it. The HOA, influenced by her long-standing social pressure, forwarded the complaints through official channels. It didn't take long before James began receiving letters. Thin envelopes slipped against his door, each containing fines dressed up in legal phrasing, each stamped with the authority of people who had never once stepped foot on his property to verify a single claim. The first letter he opened left him puzzled. The second made him frown. The third stirred something heavy inside him, not confusion, but recognition. James sat at his kitchen counter with the stack of fines spread before him like a paper battlefield. He read them slowly, carefully, absorbing every accusation. Loud gatherings, obstructive visitors, noise complaints after 10 p.m. None of them bore truth. None of them reflected the quiet, measured life he lived. But all of them carried the same underlying message. He wasn't welcome. Not here. Not next door to Clara. Not as a black man occupying a space she believed belonged exclusively to people like her. He inhaled, feeling the breath shake on its way out. His hands rested lightly on the letters, fingertips tapping unconsciously, a rhythm of contained frustration. He tried the path of reason. With a calm, professional tone, he sent invitations to every member of the HOA board. He asked them to meet at his house, to discuss the complaints, to find common ground, to let fairness lead the conversation. He offered refreshments, transparency, and his time, something far more valuable than most people realized. But on the evening of the meeting, his living room remained painfully, pointedly empty. The chairs he had arranged sat untouched. The water he had set on the table remained still. The small attempt at peace dissolved into silence that tasted bitter. He waited 30 minutes, even though he already knew the truth. Clara had gotten to them. She had rallied them, manipulated them, whispered whatever poison she needed to ensure they wouldn't show up. She had taken the tiny thread of social influence she possessed and wrapped it tightly around their decision-making. James stood by the window, staring out into the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Wind shifted through the trees. Life went on, indifferent to his frustration. He felt something inside him shift, not into anger but into clarity. A boundary snapped into place within him. He realized the nice guy approach did nothing but feed Clara's narrative, giving her ammunition he never intended to hand over. That night, he walked into his home office and closed the door gently behind him. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of his desk lamp. Shadows stretched across the bookshelves, spilling into the corners like unspoken truths. James sat down at his desk, his movements calm, controlled. He gathered the stack of fines and placed them neatly to one side, not as paperwork but as evidence of targeted hostility, evidence of a challenge presented in the most cowardly way. For a long moment, he simply stared at the blank laptop screen, his reflection faintly visible on the dark surface. His expression was steady, but there was an undercurrent in his eyes, a tiredness, a quiet ache born from being judged long before being known. Then, with a slow exhale, he opened the laptop. His fingers moved across the keys with sure precision, logging into his corporate terminal. As the system loaded, layer after layer of encrypted access, firewalls, secured dashboards, his posture shifted. Not out of arrogance, but out of the weight of responsibility he carried daily as a CEO of one of the most powerful tech firms in the country. And now, he would use knowledge, not aggression. He began researching the financial stability of every HOA board member, not to intimidate, not to threaten, but to understand the landscape they operated in. Money wasn't a weapon to him, it was information, strategic information. But Clara, he looked up her records last. Her name sat on the screen like a bruise waiting to be pressed. He clicked it. When her financial profile opened, a slow, steady realization washed over him. The facade she always presented, confidence, wealth, power, had fragile foundations, very fragile. James leaned back slightly, lips pressing into a line that wasn't anger and wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated, an understanding that this wasn't simply a petty neighbor dispute. This was structural, systemic, deep-rooted. This was a fight Clara had chosen, but one he no longer intended to ignore. He closed the last window on his screen and sat for a moment in the quiet. His home, usually a sanctuary, suddenly felt heavier, but his resolve was clearer than ever. The next move would not come from fear or frustration. It would come from truth, and he was ready. James stepped onto his patio just after sunset, loosening the top button of his shirt, finally letting his shoulders drop after 14 relentless hours of corporate emergencies. He didn't turn on any lights. The soft amber glow spilling from the living room was enough. The night air felt cooler than usual, a soft breeze brushing his face, like a reminder that he was, at last, allowed to breathe. He closed his eyes and sang quietly, a slow, tender ballad his mother used to hum while ironing clothes on Saturday mornings. It wasn't even fully singing, more like a gentle murmur, a comforting vibration in his chest. He didn't expect anyone to hear him. He wasn't performing. He was simply trying to find himself again after a day that had stolen too much of him. Across the fence, Clara's garden glittered with lanterns, wine glasses, and forced laughter. She had dressed her yard as if it were a stage, and she moved through her guests with the same theatrical precision she used in every social interaction, smiling too widely, raising her voice just enough to command attention, glancing at the gate frequently to see who might notice her next. Every gesture was curated, every word rehearsed. Someone complimented the roses lining the walkway, and Clara flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, pretending bashfulness. "Oh, they're nothing," she said loudly. "I just wanted the place to feel safe and refined. You never know who lives around you these days." A few guests nodded politely, unsure what she meant, unsure whether they wanted to understand. Then she heard James's voice, soft, melodic, carried gently on the breeze. For a moment, she paused. Not because the sound bothered her, but because the attention had shifted. Her guests looked around, curious. A few murmured something about the music sounding lovely. One woman leaned in and whispered, "Your neighbor has a beautiful voice." Clara's jaw tightened. That whisper hit her pride like a sharp stone. She smiled, but it was tense, brittle. "Yes, well," she said loudly, raising her wine glass as if signaling a change in tone. "Sometimes it's unsettling." Her guests looked at her in confusion. Clara pressed on, voice rising, performing. Listen to that. I feel so unsafe. He looks aggressive, doesn't he?" There was a murmur of discomfort. Some guests shifted awkwardly. Others exchanged wary, uncertain glances, unsure what to believe. Clara was so dramatic, so insistent, so sure of herself. She wielded confidence like a weapon. But across the fence, James just stood there, eyes closed, humming softly. He wasn't even facing her. He wasn't doing anything except trying to heal the day's bruises on his spirit. Clara pulled out her phone. One guest reached out. "Clara." Maybe you should. She stepped back, shaking her head, breathing fast like a woman convinced of her own lie. No, I can't ignore this. I refuse to be threatened in my own home. Her hands trembled with false panic, though some part of her, dark and complicated, seemed almost exhilarated by the drama she was creating. She dialed 911. Her voice changed instantly, becoming a frantic, shaky whisper filled with manufactured terror. Hello? Yes, please. I need help. There is an African-American man next door screaming and threatening me with a weapon. He's waving something, please, hurry. The guests went silent. One woman brought her hand to her mouth. Clara, are you sure? He's just... Clara shot her a glare sharp enough to slice. He's dangerous, she hissed. I know what I saw. But she hadn't seen anything. She had created it. And within minutes, the world responded to her lie. Police cars screeched onto the street, tires biting into the asphalt. Flashing lights shattered the calm night. Officers rushed onto James's property, guns drawn, voices sharp and commanding. Sir, put your hands where we can see them. James froze. His heart slammed against his ribs so violently it almost hurt. For a moment, his mind blanked, just shock, disbelief, a flash of fear he couldn't suppress even if he wanted to. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open. Officer, he said, his voice calm but trembling at the edges. My name is James Porter. I live here. I'm not holding anything. I'm not a threat. But guns stayed pointed at him. The air felt like it had turned to glass, thin, fragile, ready to shatter with the slightest wrong move. He swallowed hard. He had boardrooms at his command, foundations in his name, employees who saw him as a pillar of stability, intellect, and power. But none of that protected him in this moment. None of it mattered to the hands gripping those triggers. Sir, one officer barked. Were you threatening the neighbor? No, James said quietly. I was, singing. A few officers exchanged glances, some uncertain now. Just then, another car pulled up. A taller man stepped out, Police Chief Harlan Brooks. He took one look at James and stopped in his tracks. Mr. Porter? James lowered his head slightly. Evening, Chief. The tension drained from Brooks's face like water spilling from a broken glass. Oh, Lord, Brooks muttered, rubbing his forehead. Stand down! Weapons down! Now! The officers hesitated only a heartbeat before lowering their guns. Brooks stepped forward quickly, hands extended in apology. James, I am so sorry. We got a call, the report said. I know what it said, James replied softly. And in that moment his voice broke just a little, revealing the fear he had swallowed, the humiliation he tried to hide. Brooks's expression fell. James, I'm sorry. Truly. The apology felt genuine. But the damage was already inside James's bones, carved there by the image of guns pointed at him while he stood in his own yard. As the officers dispersed, Brooks approached Clara's fence. But Clara stayed back, clutching her wine glass like a shield, her face pale, almost ghostly. She realized she had crossed a line. She understood fully that nothing she had said could be undone. And James. James slowly shifted his head in her direction. For the first time since she'd arrived in the neighborhood, his eyes held no trace of kindness, no tolerance, no polite self-control. His stare was icy, unwavering, deadly in its quiet sharpness. It wasn't the expression of a man plotting retaliation. It was the expression of a man who had already chosen his next move. Clara felt the air snag painfully in her chest. She stepped back instinctively, chest tightening with a fear she couldn't name. He didn't say a single word to her. He didn't need to. His silence was a promise one that made her blood run cold. Clara didn't sleep the night after the police incident. She paced her bedroom until dawn, replaying James's silent stare over and over in her mind. It wasn't anger that haunted her, it was the precision of it. The quiet certainty, the way his eyes seemed to expose every fragile part of her that she tried so desperately to hide. For the first time, she felt as if someone had truly seen her, and she hated it. So when morning came, she clung desperately to the only weapon she had ever truly mastered: social perception. She slipped into her kitchen in a silk robe, poured herself a glass of water she didn't intend to drink, and opened her phone. Her hands were steady, almost unnervingly so, considering the chaos she had ignited the night before. She scrolled through her photo gallery until she found the image, one of several she'd captured during the commotion. It was a cropped shot of James looking toward her fence, his expression unreadable but intense. In context, it meant nothing. Stripped of context, it could mean anything she wanted. She stared at the image for a long, heavy moment. Her reflection in the black screen looked tired, older than she liked to admit. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about pride anymore. It was about control, something she felt slipping through her fingers like fine silk. She typed the caption slowly, deliberately. Living next to a predator. #unsafe. She hit post. And the world began to move. Within minutes, comments trickled in, mostly whispers of concern from acquaintances who knew her only through curated brunch photos and charity gala appearances. But soon, the trickle became a stream. Her elite circles, the ones she spent years infiltrating through charm, appearance, and calculated connections, rallied around her instantly. "Oh, honey, are you okay? Do you need a safe place to stay? I always had a bad feeling about him." The comments stung in a way she didn't expect. She wanted vindication, yes, but reading their concern felt like stepping into a lie, so large she could no longer see the edges of it. Yet she kept scrolling, heart racing with the kind of adrenaline that felt dangerously close to relief. Across town, in the penthouse conference room of his company's headquarters, James stared at his phone while his PR team murmured in restrained panic around him. His thumb hovered over the screen, reading the same caption again and again, as if repetition might make it less absurd, less cruel. Living next to a predator. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that felt heavier than any corporate crisis he had survived. One of his PR directors stepped toward him, voice tight. "We're monitoring the engagement. The post is gaining traction, mostly in her social circles, but a few influencers have picked it up." James didn't look up. She cropped the photo. "Yes," the director said, choosing his words carefully. She framed it, intentionally. James set the phone down like it was something fragile, something that could break if touched too firmly. "And the stock?" The room went still for a moment before someone answered. "We've seen a slight dip. Nothing catastrophic yet, but investors are nervous. Nervous. Over a lie. Over an image stripped of truth. Over a woman's performance that had nearly cost him his life the night before." Another advisor cleared her throat gently. "James, you could settle. Issue a statement. Maybe even consider relocating. It would show good faith, de-escalate, move." James repeated, softly but with an edge that cut through the air. "You want me to move out of my own home because of a neighbor's lie?" "It might calm the waters," she whispered. James leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment as he pressed his fingers to his temples. Exhaustion crept through him, not physical but emotional, sinking into places he didn't want to acknowledge. "This isn't about calming waters," he said. "This is about someone trying to erase me." His voice cracked slightly and he cleared his throat, steadying himself. "I won't be erased." No one spoke after that. Later, when he returned home, the weight of Clara's accusation still clung to the air like humidity. He stood in his office, staring at his framed philanthropic awards. The grants he had funded, the scholarships he had created. He had always believed that if he lived with integrity, people would see it. But Clara didn't need truth. She needed an audience. He opened his laptop, fingers moving with quiet deliberation, not fueled by rage, not even by revenge, but by something deeper, an insistence on reclaiming his dignity. He typed Clara's full name, then her maiden name, then her family's company. It didn't take long to unravel the pristine facade she had spent years polishing. Articles appeared, financial reports written in sanitized corporate language, but revealing undeniable trouble. The once lavish fashion empire her mother built was sinking fast, shackled by debt, lawsuits, unpaid vendors, and a rapidly shrinking market. He read profit-loss statements, saw the trend lines diving downward, noted how Clara had begun selling property years ago to patch the holes. She had masked the desperation behind pearls, designer clothing, and extravagant events. But the truth was simple. She was running out of rope. James sat back staring at the glowing screen. A quiet, heavy sadness fluttered through him, unexpected, unwelcome. Clara's life was a castle built out of sand, and she had chosen him as the enemy because facing herself was too unbearable. But sadness didn't cancel out the damage she'd done. He closed the laptop gently, as if sealing a decision he knew he couldn't walk back. He would not allow her lies to define him. He would not allow her fear theater to control his life. His voice, when he spoke into the quiet room, was steady, almost soft. No more defense. The words felt like a turning point, like stepping out of a shadow he didn't realize he'd been standing in. He made several calls. Short, efficient, measured. Within 24 hours, the plan was in motion. He began a hostile takeover of the bank that held the mortgage to Clara's home, a move that would send ripples through business circles, a move only someone with James's reach and financial power could even attempt. But for him, it wasn't about cruelty. It was about truth reclaiming its place, about refusing to let a lie destroy him. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the exhaustion and the hurt, a quiet strength began to take shape, one that felt less like retaliation and more like survival, like rebirth. Clara had always imagined herself at the center of the neighborhood's social world, but tonight, the center shifted without her permission. As twilight settled over the cul-de-sac, a fleet of polished black SUVs began rolling toward James's mansion, each one reflecting the warm glow of the estate lights like moving mirrors. The air trembled with quiet anticipation, the kind that signaled something important was happening, something that did not include her. Clara stood by her upstairs window, pressing her fingertips against the glass so hard it cooled her skin. She watched the red carpet being rolled out across James's front walkway. She saw servers in crisp uniforms carrying trays of crystal glasses. She saw photographers positioning themselves at the perfect angles, checking lighting, murmuring to each other about expected arrivals. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a statement. James's house, his home, had been transformed into the epicenter of influence, generosity, and power. The enormous floral arrangements guiding guests toward the entrance weren't ostentatious. They were intentional, refined, signaling taste, wealth, and a depth of connection that no amount of social climbing could fabricate. Clara's stomach tightened. Her throat felt small, dry, as if her own body were turning against her in humiliation. Then the cars arrived. A senator stepped out of the first one, straightening his suit as he greeted James with a firm handshake and a warm, familiar laugh. 2 CEOs followed, then famous actors, philanthropists, athletes, people Clara had spent years trying to orbit, always at a distance, always pretending she belonged near them. But tonight, they weren't looking in her direction. They weren't even aware of her existence. They were here for him, for James. She whispered to herself, unable to stop the words from trembling out. How? How is this happening? She watched James glide through the crowd with a calm dignity, his tuxedo pressed perfectly, his posture confident but never arrogant. Guests leaned toward him as he spoke, not out of flattery, but genuine admiration. A movie star touched his shoulder lightly as she laughed at something he said. A tech billionaire clasped James's arm in a gesture that spoke of long-standing partnership. Clara felt something inside her crack open. It wasn't jealousy, it was exposure. A raw, sickening exposure of the truth she tried so hard to bury that she had never been invited into true influence. She had only wandered in its shadows, pretending. Her pulse quickened with panic. She grabbed her purse, applied fresh lipstick with shaking hands, and marched toward her door. She couldn't be on the outside. Not tonight. Not when everything was slipping away. When she reached the gate of James's estate, she forced a broad, confident smile onto her face, the kind she wore at charity luncheons and gallery openings. But the security guard stepped forward immediately. "Evening, ma'am. Invitation, please." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You know who I am." One of the guards remained respectful but firm. "Yes, ma'am." "Even so, we need to see your invitation. I live next door." She snapped, jabbing a finger toward her house as if that alone granted her access. The guard didn't move. "Invitation, ma'am." Clara's voice grew sharper, scraping against the night air. "I don't need an invitation. I'm here to speak to James." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the guard said with the same patient tone. "But this is a private charity event. I am part of this community," she shouted, her voice breaking. Before the guards could respond, footsteps approached from behind them, slow, even, unhurried. James walked toward the gate, a glass of water in his hand, his tuxedo lit by the soft glow of the garden lanterns. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. His expression held something colder, clarity. He stopped a few feet from the gate and regarded her for a long moment. For a second, Clara imagined he might take pity on her, offer her a chance to step inside, let her slip into the illusion that she wasn't losing everything she thought she controlled. But James simply raised the glass slightly, as though toasting to the truth, finally revealing itself. "This is a private event, Clara," he said, his voice calm, steady, almost gentle. "For people who know how to behave." The words hit her harder than anything he had said before, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And Clara couldn't bear truth. Her face twisted. She tried to speak, but the humiliation surged through her like a wave of fire, and then something inside her snapped. "You," she shrieked, pointing at him with a trembling hand. "You, people like you." She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she let loose a hateful string of words she had kept hidden behind charm and pearls. Words that had always lived somewhere deep in her, festering in silence. They tore from her throat in a torrent racial slurs, venomous accusations, hateful declarations spoken not just from anger, but fear. Her voice echoed against the driveway pavers, bounced off the stone columns, and carried straight toward the cluster of reporters positioned just behind the velvet rope. For a moment she didn't realize the cameras had turned. She didn't realize her meltdown. The raw cruelty of it was being filmed from every angle. James didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, and he turned, slowly, toward the cameras. And in a voice quiet enough to make the crowd lean closer, he said, "This is the reality I live with every day." Something in the air shifted. A cold stillness settled over the moment, making it feel heavy, almost sacred, as if truth had chosen that precise second to reveal itself fully. Clara froze. The weight of her words suddenly pressed down on her shoulders, suffocating, undeniable. For the first time in her adult life, she had lost control not through subtle missteps, but through the exposure of her own unfiltered hatred recorded, witnessed, undeniable. James walked away from the gate, not with triumph, not with spite, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had stopped apologizing for existing. The crowd parted for him naturally, their respect forming an invisible halo around his path. Clara remained outside, trembling, breath shallow, realizing too late that nothing she could say or do would undo what had happened. The night continued without her, and the world, in that moment, finally saw who she really was. By morning, the world knew her name for all the wrong reasons. The video of Clara's outburst, every word, every tremble of her face, every flash of hatred she had tried to disguise for years, spread like wildfire. It was clipped, reposted, slowed down, subtitled, dissected. It appeared on social feeds, news segments, commentary channels, and group chats she had once been a part of. Within hours, the polished veneer she had cultivated over decades, the charity galas, the carefully curated social circles, the whispered alliances shattered beyond repair. Her phone vibrated constantly at first. Messages from acquaintances pretending to check in, thinly veiled attempts to confirm whether the video was real. Then the messages shifted in tone: confusion, judgment, condemnation. Friends who used to linger at her side in public now distanced themselves with sterile statements, claiming they had no awareness of Clara's private views. Her family group chat went silent. Invitations disappeared. Brand partnerships quietly dissolved. By afternoon, her phone stopped vibrating altogether. Silence replaced the noise. Clara sat on her pristine sofa, still wearing last night's foundation-stained dress, staring blankly at her reflection in the black screen of the TV. The house felt cavernous, heavy with a kind of emptiness that made her chest ache. She looked smaller than she remembered, like someone the world had moved on from overnight. She whispered to herself, voice shaking, "They'll forget. They always forget." But even she didn't believe it. When the doorbell rang, she jolted upright with a gasp of relief flooding her, desperate for any sign that someone, anyone, still saw her as human. But when she opened the door, there wasn't a friend or a neighbor. There was a courier envelope. Inside were notices, past due warnings, loan recall letters, a formal notification from the bank. Her debts had been called in immediately, without negotiation. Her breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the kitchen island, spreading out all the documents with frantic hands. The numbers looked unreal: interest, penalties, balances she had never bothered to fully understand because she had always assumed she was safe. Her family legacy had always protected her. Always. She grabbed her keys and drove to the bank, her mind spiraling with the certainty that this was a misunderstanding. She had known the branch manager for years. She had been invited to his daughter's wedding. Surely he would fix this. When she entered the bank, people stared. Some whispered. A teller quickly pretended to reorganize papers just to avoid eye contact. Clara felt her skin prickle with humiliation, but she kept walking, chin trembling but lifted. She burst into the manager's office without knocking. "Richard, what the hell is this?" she demanded, slamming the stack of papers onto his desk. The manager, normally warm and obsequious, flinched as if she were a stranger. He stood slowly, smoothing his tie with nervous hands. "Mrs. Westbridge, I was going to call," he stammered. "You should have called the moment these were sent," she snapped. "This is absurd. My loans are secured. Everyone knows my family's reputation. You know who I am." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to say it out loud, not after last night's scandal. He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, the decision didn't come from this branch." "Then override it," she ordered, waving her hand dismissively. "Do your job." He winced. "I can't." For the first time, a ripple of fear passed through her. It crawled up her spine, fragile and cold. Clara leaned closer. "What do you mean you can't?" The manager's voice softened as though he wished he could shrink behind the desk. The directive came from corporate, from the top of the new ownership group. "What ownership group?" she said sharply. He hesitated, looked at the door, looked at his computer. Sweat glistened near his hairline. "Just tell me who owns the bank," she insisted, her voice cracking with a desperate edge she could no longer hide. Richard exhaled shakily, sat down, and with reluctant fingers turned his computer monitor toward her. The parent company's logo appeared in bold silver letters. Sterling Global Ventures. Clara's lips parted. She did not breathe. Her entire body went still, as though her bones had turned to stone. She stared at the screen as if it were a hallucination. Because it had to be. It had to be. Her voice emerged as a faint whisper. No, 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 no. But the manager said nothing. His silence confirmed everything. The man she had humiliated. The man she had treated like the help. The man she had called the police on, lied about, tried to force out of the neighborhood, slandered online. He owned the bank. He owned her debt. He owned the mortgage of her precious house. He owned every financial string she had pretended she was pulling. Her knees buckled slightly. She reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself. A fragile, shaking breath escaped her. Her eyes blurred with a wave of sudden, raw panic. "How long?" she whispered. The manager lifted his gaze with deep sympathy, the kind reserved for someone who has run out of roads to take. "The acquisition was finalized this morning," he said softly. The recall notices were the first orders issued. Clara stepped back, hope slipping through her fingers like water. The room felt suddenly airless. Every humiliation she had inflicted on James began flashing through her memory not as triumphs, but as irreversible wounds she had carved with her own hand. She whispered, broken, he owns everything. No one answered. She already knew. For the first time in her adult life, Clara felt utterly powerless, stripped bare. Exposed not by society, not by scandal, but by the consequences of her own actions finally closing in. And somewhere, deep inside her chest, a tiny, terrified voice began to whisper the truth she had never imagined she would have to confront. She had gone to war with a man who fought back, and he had won. Clara didn't remember driving to the towering glass building that housed Sterling Global Ventures. She barely remembered grabbing her keys, barely remembered the sound of her own breath cracking inside her chest as she muttered to herself like someone spiraling down the last edge of a cliff. Her heels clacked against the marble lobby floor in a frantic, uneven rhythm, the kind of sound that made receptionists stand in half alarm as she barreled through, eyes wild, hair unbrushed, mascara smeared from hours of panic. Security called after her, first politely, then more sharply, but she didn't hear them. Or maybe she did, but she refused to listen. The world felt underwater, muffled and distorted, except for the overwhelming, paralyzing need to get to him. To demand something: mercy, reversal, understanding, punishment. Anything that would stop the avalanche swallowing her life whole. She slammed both palms against the elevator doors until they opened. She stabbed the top floor button so hard her finger went numb. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked like a stranger. Eyes swollen, foundation cracked, lipstick faded to a tired outline. She had once been the picture of curated elegance. Now she looked as though grief had hollowed her out in a single night. When the doors opened on James's floor, she sprinted past the glass sculptures and dark steel beams, ignoring the startled assistant who stood up so fast her chair toppled backwards. "Ma'am, you need an appointment." But Clara was already pushing the double doors to James's office, nearly stumbling inside. He sat behind a massive glass desk overlooking the skyline, posture steady, expression unreadable. Papers lay neatly arranged before him, his pen moving in calm, measured strokes. He didn't flinch at the sound of the doors bursting open. He didn't even lift his gaze. "James," she cried, breath breaking, "you have to stop this." He finished signing the document he was working on, closed the folder gently, and finally looked up. His eyes were steady, too steady, not angry, not amused. Something colder. Something that had distance in it. The kind people used to protect themselves from memories they didn't choose. She staggered closer. "You're ruining my life. You..." Her voice wavered. "You have to make this. Stop." James rested his elbows on the armrests of his chair, fingers interlaced. Then, in a voice so calm it felt like a slap, he said, "You ruined yourself, Clara. I just bought the wreckage." She flinched visibly, as if the air around him had turned sharp. For a moment, she seemed confused, like she couldn't understand why he wasn't folding under the weight of her distress, the way so many others had over the years. I was upset," she stammered. "You don't understand how hard it is, how much pressure I'm under. I'm a woman alone. I don't have anyone to help me. People expect so much from me, and I've been trying to hold everything together and—" Her voice cracked as tears spilled over. She tried to wipe them away, but the gesture only smeared mascara across her cheek. James stood slowly, not abruptly, not theatrically, simply with purpose. He picked up a folder from the edge of the desk and set it down with a sharp, echoing smack. "You called the police on me!" She froze. "You tried to weaponize my skin color to have me removed," he said, stepping closer. "You looked at me, covered in grease, exhausted, worried about my bank account, and you decided I didn't belong. You decided I was a threat." His voice trembled on the last word, not with weakness, but with a depth of hurt so old and so familiar it had become carved into him. "You wanted me gone?" he said quietly. "Fine." He slid the folder across the desk toward her. "Now you're the one leaving." Her eyes widened. She touched the papers with trembling fingers as if they might burn her. "No, no, no, this can't be. This isn't. It's the foreclosure notice," he said, his tone steady but merciless. "You have 48 hours to vacate the property." The room fell painfully silent. Clara's jaw dropped. "James, I have nowhere to go." She grasped at the edge of the desk as if the glass might somehow keep her upright. "Please, please, you can't just do this. You can't just throw me out." James looked down at her hands, clutching the desk, desperate, frantic, lost. For a split second, a flicker of something passed over his face. Not pity, not sympathy. Something more complicated, recognition of a human being falling apart. But he didn't reach out, he didn't soften, because he remembered the way her voice had sounded when she accused him at the bank. The certainty, the indignation, the cruelty that came so naturally she didn't even notice it. He stepped back, putting physical distance between them. "This is not revenge," he said quietly. "This is accountability. For the first time in your life, someone said no and made it stick." She shook her head violently, tears dripping off her chin. "You don't understand my reputation, my social circle. Everything is gone. People hate me. The internet hates me. I'm nothing now." James inhaled slowly, as though filling himself with the strength not to waver. "You'll survive this," he said. "But you'll survive it as someone who finally understands consequences. Something I've lived with all my life, simply for existing." She released a guttural sob, a sound so raw it echoed off the office walls. "Please," she whispered, "please don't do this." James walked back to his chair, sat down, and picked up another stack of documents. 48 hours, Clara," he said without looking at her. "That's all." Her knees buckled for a moment before she caught herself on the doorframe. She stared at him, waiting, hoping for even the smallest gesture that might save her. There wasn't one. And when she finally left the office, the only sound she carried with her was the hollow echo of a man who had chosen justice over mercy and life that was no longer hers, collapsing behind her. Clara's hands shook as she closed the trunk of the small, dented car she had managed to borrow from a distant cousin, one who had stopped returning her calls the moment her scandal went viral, but who, out of pity or fear of bad karma, agreed to let her use it for a single day. The trunk barely shut, the latch clicking like a reluctant goodbye. Her last suitcase was wedged beside a few hastily packed boxes, their edges frayed from the chaotic week she'd spent stripping the house of what few belongings she still possessed. The front yard of the mansion she was being forced to leave looked almost unreal in the soft morning light, as though she were seeing it for the first time and the last all at once. The manicured hedges, the gleaming stone facade, the sweeping staircase leading to the heavy double doors, all the pieces of a life she'd curated so obsessively, now reduced to a backdrop she no longer belonged to. She had once taken pride in how pristine everything looked. Now it all felt like a cruel exhibit, a monument to the person she used to pretend she was. She stood silently for a long moment, taking in the home she'd lost. Pride, denial, anger, grief, they layered inside her like sediment too heavy to shake off. She felt hollowed out, as if the last of her dignity had been packed away inside one of those boxes. Everything else had already been stripped from her social status. Friends, invitations, the flattering whispers at coffee shops and charity galas. People avoided her now. They didn't even bother to hide it. Some crossed the street when they saw her. Others watched from afar with thin smiles, satisfied to see her finally fall. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. When she turned her head, she saw James. He was on his porch across the yard, sitting in a wooden chair with his guitar resting across his knee. The morning sun caught on the polished strings, scattering faint glimmers. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a soft, worn t-shirt, but somehow he still looked more grounded, more dignified than she had ever felt even at her most glamorous. His fingers brushed the edge of the guitar, not playing, just holding it as if it steadied him. For a dreadful, humiliating moment, Clara thought he might be watching her fall apart. She braced herself for mockery, for a smirk, for that cold indifference from the office. She almost turned away to spare herself the moment, but her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward him with slow, heavy steps. Her breath trembled as she approached the porch, gravel crunching beneath her shoes. She didn't lift her eyes at first. She couldn't. Shame had a way of bending a person's spine, making the world tilt downward. "You won," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It felt like the last thing she had left to give, acknowledgement of her own downfall. James didn't respond immediately. He watched her with a stillness she didn't understand. There was no triumph in his eyes, no smugness. Instead, there was something quieter, more complex, something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, but not soft. Measured. Honest. "I didn't want to win, Clara," he said. "I just wanted to live in peace." The words hit her harder than any punishment he had ever given. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she'd done, not just the consequences, but the root cause. She had stolen peace from him simply because she believed she was entitled to it more than he was. She blinked up at him through tears she tried and failed to hold back. I never thought it would come to this." He didn't argue. He didn't challenge her statement or correct it. He simply stepped inside, and for a brief moment she thought he was walking away, that this tiny flicker of fragile respect was all she would get. But then he returned with a small white card between his fingers. He set the guitar aside and stepped down one stair, enough that the two of them were closer, sharing the same air, the same moment. He held out the card. She didn't take it at first. She stared at it as though it were dangerous or fragile, or both. "It's a program," he said quietly. "My foundation runs it. It helps people rebuild after they've lost their footing." Clara's eyebrows pressed together. I don't understand. "It provides temporary housing," James said, "and a job. Nothing glamorous, but steady. Enough to help you get back on your feet." Clara exhaled shakily. Her fingers brushed the air between them, hesitant. "But there's a condition," he added. Her hand froze. "You have to attend bias training," he continued, "and work in the community you despised." A small sharp sound escaped her, a breath caught between pain and disbelief. "James, it's not charity," he said. "It's accountability, and an opportunity. You decide what to make of it." She finally took the card. Her hand trembled as she slid it from his. It was heavier than paper should be, as if responsibility itself had been pressed into its fibers. She looked at the printed name, the address, the contact number. Simple, unadorned, honest. A lifeline, but one wrapped in humility, vulnerability, and change. Accepting it meant stepping into a world she had spent her entire life pretending was beneath her. It meant dismantling her entire worldview piece by piece until she could see clearly again. Her breath hitched. "Do you really think I can?" "I think," he said, choosing his words with care, "that the person you were isn't the person you have to become." Her throat tightened around something fragile, something unbearably human. She nodded, small, barely visible, but it was the most sincere gesture she had given in years. James didn't smile, but his expression softened, just enough to shift the air between them. A subtle mercy. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but the possibility of becoming someone worthy of it someday. Behind her, the house she had lost looked colder, emptier, like a chapter already closing. In her hand, the card felt warm. A beginning. A choice. A path toward something she had never truly known. Rebuilding not through entitlement, but through effort. Through humility. Through facing the truth of who she had been and who she might still be. She stepped back, clutching the card to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from defeat, but from the quiet, aching realization that even at the bottom, someone had handed her a thread of hope. Not out of obligation, but out of humanity, out of the chance for reformation, out of mercy unexpected, undeserved, but offered all the same. 1 year later, the world looked different, quieter, softer, as if time itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The city park stretched wide under a pale spring sun, its pathways dotted with joggers, families, and older couples enjoying their morning rituals. The air carried the faint sweetness of blooming dogwood trees and the gentle hum of everyday life. And there, settled on a familiar wooden bench near the fountain, sat James. He held his guitar with a familiarity that bordered on reverence. The instrument had always been more than polished wood and strings. It was memory, solace, truth. He plucked a few warm, tentative chords, letting them wander into the air, unhurried and unafraid. His hands moved with a steadiness shaped by years of discipline and a calm that had taken just as long to earn. He was no longer anonymous here. People recognized him now, not as the CEO in headlines, not as the man targeted by scandal, but as himself, James Sterling, the musician who played in the park because music helped him breathe. Passers-by offered respectful distance. A few nodded in quiet acknowledgement as they walked by, honoring his space the way one might honor a prayer. Others sat far enough away to listen without intruding, carried by the soft notes drifting across the lawn. For the first time in a long while, James felt unburdened. The chaos that had once tried to suffocate him had faded like a storm driven into the horizon, leaving behind the calm clarity of truth. He had fought back without losing himself, without surrendering the gentler parts of his soul. Now, as his fingers danced across the strings, he felt a sense of harmony he hadn't known he'd been searching for. As he played, a figure appeared at the edge of his vision. A slow, hesitant silhouette approaching from the pathway. James didn't stop strumming, but his eyes lifted, curious. It was Clara. He almost didn't recognize her at first. The woman walking toward him bore almost no resemblance to the sharp, polished socialite who had once wielded entitlement like a weapon. Her hair was tied back simply, free of the stiff perfection she used to chase. She wore a plain uniform from the community center, its colors muted, its fabric clean but practical. There were no designer logos, no towering heels, no cloud of expensive perfume announcing her presence. But the most striking difference wasn't her clothes. It was her expression. Gone was the cold superiority, the false confidence, the brittle pride. Her face was open now, vulnerable, quiet, almost tender in its humility. She walked with small, measured steps, as if approaching something sacred or fragile, or both. Each footfall carried the weight of a year spent rebuilding not her reputation, but her character. James felt his breath shift, a faint stir of emotion rising in his chest. He kept playing, letting the strings carry him through the moment. Clara stopped before him, not too close, not invading, just near enough to be felt. She didn't speak. Her hands were clasped together at first, trembling slightly. Then slowly she reached into her pocket. When she opened her fingers, a single white rose rested there, its petals soft and unblemished. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. She didn't try to justify herself. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't craft excuses or explanations. She simply leaned down, gently placing the white rose into the open guitar case at his feet. The gesture was small in movement, but enormous in meaning, an offering of peace, an apology without words, a symbol of a year spent unlearning, relearning, choosing better. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them kept flowing, children laughing near the fountain, a dog tugging its leash, the faint whistle of wind through fresh leaves, but the space between James and Clara felt suspended, held in a delicate balance of presence and truth. Clara straightened slowly, her eyes glistening. Not with expectation, there was no plea, no demand in them, but with gratitude, fear, and something that looked like hope. Quiet hope, earned hope. James's fingers stilled on the strings. He lifted his head and met her gaze, a simple nod, nothing more, nothing less. Yet it landed like a bell ringing through her chest, a silent acknowledgement of the work she had done. A recognition of change, not complete, not perfect, but real. A gesture that said, I see you, I see your effort. I see that you tried. Clara's breath shook as she exhaled. She stepped back slowly, giving him space, respectfully, deliberately. She didn't linger. She didn't ask for conversation. She simply turned and walked away. The community center emblem on her back catching the sunlight for a brief, gentle moment before she blended into the hum of the park. James watched her disappear, then lowered his gaze to the rose resting among the coins and soft velvet of his guitar case. Its white petals looked almost luminous against the dark interior, a quiet symbol of closure, transformation, and unexpected healing. His chest loosened. He lifted his guitar again, closed his eyes, and let his fingers fall into a new melody. It wasn't mournful. It wasn't somber. It rose slowly, gently, like dawn climbing over the horizon. A hopeful tune, threaded with warmth and forgiveness, woven from the same resilience that had carried him through the darkest chapters of his life. The music flourished, lifting into the air with a tenderness that wrapped around the park like a soft embrace. People paused to listen. Birds quieted. Even the fountain's steady rhythm seemed to soften. And James's closed. Smile faint and honest, felt something settle inside him. Harmony. Not the kind forced by power or wealth. Not the kind granted by fear or dominance. But the kind built slowly, patiently, through truth, dignity, and courage. He had found respect not because he demanded it, but because he lived in a way that made it inevitable. He had found peace not because the world offered it freely, but because he carved it out one quiet act at a time. And as his music drifted into the spring air, he understood something deeper. Dignity cannot be bought. But sometimes it can be taught. Sometimes it can ripple outward, touching even the lives that once tried to diminish it. His melody rose, bright and full of promise. A new tune, a new chapter, a life reclaimed, not through vengeance, but through truth. And somewhere, walking away with slow, steady steps, a woman held on to her own fragile sense of beginning. If this story moved you, inspired you, or kept you company today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives like this one.